the photographs from Cochabamba. Cochabamba, to my deep frustration, I was in Cochabamba, but just a year too early. So that square, which you saw packed with people, when I was in it, there was nobody there. So, but it was wonderful then to see it full with ordinary people resisting and fighting back. But why was Cochabamba so important? And it was hugely significant. It echoes here, it echoes around the world. Because Cochabamba marked the end of a decade of global theft. A decade in which, in Bolivia, for example, a famous or rather infamous economist from Harvard called Jeffrey Sachs, whenever you see an economic disaster anywhere in the world, Jeffrey Sachs has just visited, you know, and told them really what they need to do is introduce more privatization and his model. He's grown richer, most of the country he visits grow poorer as a result. But anyway, he went to Bolivia and he said Bolivia is a wonderful laboratory for neoliberalism, for the new policies of the World Bank and the IMF. Now what did that mean? Well, it meant that 75% of Bolivia's population were living in poverty. It meant that public resources had been privatized massively, and this was the last one. That's why Bolivia was a successful example of the new global politics. And the 90s were a decade in which not just Bolivia, but the whole of Latin America and most of the global south suffered directly the effects of what had various names. I mean, there's a small unit somewhere in America producing producing euphemisms. This particular one, they call it structural adjustment. And they had the gall to call it, towards the end of the 90s, the war against poverty. That was the phrase the IMF and the World Bank used. But what it meant was privatization and the impoverishment of whole populations. Cochabamba turned the tide. I'm sorry, there'll be the odd water metaphor which I'll slip in, and this turned the tide. And just to use one more metaphor and then I'll stop. It was the last drop, as they say in Spanish, la última gota que colmó el vaso. It was the last drop and the final one which made the glass overflow. It was one step too far. Cochabamba, like the other cities of Bolivia, had suffered attack after attack after attack, until finally they faced the possibility that they would have to make a choice, quite seriously and literally, a choice between water or food. That's what the people of Cochabamba faced that day, and they turned against Bechtel, they turned against the policies of the government, they turfed out a government and initiated a decade of resistance against globalization and neoliberalism. The same was happening elsewhere, actually in a much less well-known example, in Ecuador. At the same time, at the very beginning of 2000, a mass movement which embraced trade unions, a kind of civic movement, but led by the indigenous people's movement, confronted a government and also ejected a government, first one, then another, and then a third, which is not a bad achievement over 3 years. They turfed out governments. So one after another, Cochabamba set in motion. It was a spark that set in motion a kind of a network of resistance. In Argentina, the IMF's decision to punish the Argentines for not paying the service on their debt produced a kind of mass resistance proliferating across the country, particularly in the capital, with the wonderful slogan, "Get rid of them all, que se vayan todos, enough is enough." And that slogan began to echo across Latin America and inaugurate the decade of resistance. 3 years later, exactly the same policy that was tried in Cochabamba and which was defeated was tried with in La Paz as well, and it met with the same generalized mass resistance. But so, in a sense, this decade and you know is a decade of resistance and fighting back against the depredations of global capital. But I think when we talk about water, it's interesting. I was reading yesterday. You'll be very glad to hear, as I was, very relieved to hear that Pepsi Cola is now inaugurating a large ecological campaign to save the planet. But I had a little bit of difficulty. Maybe somebody can help me, because apparently they said that they were returning the water to its sources. Now, try as I might, I couldn't work that one out. I know, for example, that Coca-Cola owns now, thanks to the Colombian government, large stretches of the Colombian river network, with the result that hundreds, if not thousands, of small farmers are gradually being expelled towards the city where they will provide cheap labour. And this is the same example again and again. And the other thing, again, surprisingly, General Electric has now inaugurated an international fund to save the economy. Now, you may consider me sceptical and cynical, but I don't believe them. And I don't believe them because unless we are to have rivers of Pepsi-Cola, I really can't see how they can restore it. But I use that to point to something else, and that when we talk about water, we talk about domestic consumption, this is the battle that everybody can grasp. My tap, my water. In the 90s, the corporations could get away with anything. Just one example was Coca-Cola's launch of a new brand of bottled water called Dasani. They made an agreement with all the student unions in Britain to have an exclusive monopoly in student unions of Dasani water, until somebody found out Dasani was the water from the public water supply of Purley in Surrey, which Coca-Cola was stealing. So they stopped selling Dasani in Britain and sold twice as much in the United States, taking it from another public water source. They could get away with it in the 90s. They couldn't get away with it as the 21st century began. But as we talk about water, I think a great deal of emphasis is placed in the discussions about water on domestic consumption, private consumption, and so on. But I think we need to understand that water is life, and that water is energy, and that water is a source of energy for all of those same corporations. I mean, Veolia, by the late 90s, there were probably 4 or so corporations controlling the world water industry. Veolia was one, Lyonnaise, Suez, and the German multinational. The value of the market then was something like, Veolia's profits reached above something like $46 billion. When they were challenged, they moved aside and moved into other areas. But water is the heart. And the problem is that our water supplies and the Earth's water is not being taken by excessive consumption by ordinary people in their homes and daily lives. In fact, only 5% of the world's water is used in domestic consumption. 25% is used by industry and 70% by agriculture. It's misused. It's used wastefully. It's used taking into consideration solely profit, with no consideration whatsoever for either social effect or the social good. And it's covered by an argument that everybody here so far has referred to it, Jimmy, yourself, Marcella, which is, if you like, the politics of the debate. And we have to come back and say again and again and again what every speaker has said, and we should repeat endlessly. Water is a right. It is a common good. Now, according to the World Bank and the IMF, it isn't. It's a sleight of hand. They call it an economic good. And we have to be aware of what that really means. An economic good is a commodity which is open for trading, for buying and selling. And the real significance of that, there are a million examples, but take one. Soweto, Veolia went to South Africa, and they were negotiating a contract to provide water in Soweto. They then withdrew on the grounds that Soweto, the population of Soweto, would be unlikely to be able to pay for their water, and therefore they withdrew. Now, what do we say to that? I mean, in 1987, the Brunson report, which disappeared, more or less, announced and predicted the intense difficulties that would come with water scarcity and water poverty. The Millennium Goals recognized that 1.3 billion people in the world did not have access to clean water, and that more than double that number did not have access to wastewater and adequate sanitation. The awful truth is that after 15 years of the 21st century, after a global economy which has announced again and again and again its concern for the environment, that figure has barely changed at all. Now, is that the result of population explosion? Is it the result of the fact that they live in water-poor countries? Well, there are many answers to it, but the simple truth is that the water of the world is diverted overwhelmingly towards activities whose sole purpose is the generation of profit. Why in California or in Colorado do they grow alfalfa, which is a crop renowned, which is a water-thirsty crop? Why, for example, it's an example everybody uses, but it's very dramatic. You may have heard of it, the Aral Sea in central Russia. A sea which, if you saw pictures of the Aral Sea 30 years ago, there were 40,000 or so families around the banks of the sea fishing for a living. If you go to that sea now, the only activity in that area is camel herding. It has turned into a desert. The reason? Because a dam was built to divert the sources of water towards a cotton-growing area, towards growing cotton, which is very, very thirsty in water for export. In other words, the fate of our water is determined, as so many other things are. When we talk about privatization, that's what we mean. When we talk about the public-private partnership, as you brought up quite rightly, beware, what that really means is that the public purse will continue to provide the infrastructure to ensure that private firms are not required to spend money, for example, on repairing leaks. Mexico City, 50% of Mexico City's water is lost through leakage, which private companies don't repair. So the public-private partnership is the state sustaining and supporting private capital to ensure that its level of profits remain high. We have to be very, very clear that that's what it's about. So that when we discuss water and water provision, we should take very seriously the sense that, in a sense, every time we see a drop of water leaking from the tap, we should look at that drop of water and say, in that drop of water and its fate, is somehow encapsulated and symbolized the relationships which are shaping the world and the world economy as a whole. But the interesting question is, how do we fight it? And one of the characteristics of globalization is that the panorama, the horizons are so enormous that sometimes we feel impotent. Global capital moves across the world with considerable ease. It's a great deal less easy for us to move our battles across the world, for workers to move across the world where they are stopped at every frontier, prevented from travelling and so on. The capital moves easily across the world, backwards and forwards. It takes advantage. It drains the water table. It diverts rivers. The Chinese economy is growing. It needs copper. It's mining copper in Peru. It's destroying the lands and the Amazon basin. And so on. So when we talk about water, we're talking about the whole system. We're talking about the fact not only that our water is taken, but then it is restored to us by the mining companies, by Pepsi-Cola, by GEC, contaminated and polluted. And fracking is a big issue fundamentally because of the amount of water it uses and because of the way it contaminates the entire water table. So our enemy are the water companies, but our enemy is the system that they sustain and represent. A system which says all that is in the earth is an economic good for trade and profit. Whereas we should shout loud, as every one of us have done, and will continue to do through the day, that this is a right, a common good. It belongs to us all, and it cannot be appropriated and turned into an economy, turned into a commodity. And since everybody else is finishing with poetry, I'll finish with poetry, or at least the words of a revolutionary, some 400 years ago, a man called Gerald Winstanley, who led a movement called the Diggers, who had the gall to take over land, work it in common, and make it their own. And Winstanley said, no man has any right to buy and sell the earth for private gain. This earth was made a common treasury for all. It's 400 years old, but it resonates right to this day.